The killpen at Riverside Livestock Auction reeked of ammonia, dread, and an inevitability that settled into the bones of anyone who stood nearby on a Tuesday morning when unwanted horses were sold by the pound to buyers whose business was the slaughter trade. For decades, horses that no one wanted anymore were crammed into muddy pens and sold to middlemen who shipped them across borders to places where American horses quietly became somebody else's meat. Marcus Webb had spent 23 years in the world of horses as a trainer, buying hopeful youngsters, selling polished performers, guiding clients through the messy maze of equine commerce. He was familiar with the chaos of the sales ring, but the killpen had been territory he never crossed. Until that day, there had never been reason to step inside that particular circle of hell reserved for animals whose time had run out. Marcus stood outside the chain link, fingers wrapped around the cold wire until they ached, looking at 47 horses jammed into the small, saturated enclosure, each animal waiting to be led through the auction and weighed like any other livestock. Most were old, lame, injured, or simply unloved, the predictable casualties of an industry that bred in excess while turning a blind eye to care. But one horse did not belong there. Even at a glance, even with years and neglect written across his body, one animal struck Marcus in a way the others did not. Near the back of the muddy mass, a bay stallion stood with ribs pushed sharply beneath a dull coat, scars tracking along his sides, a mane matted into dirty ropes. Despite the years of abuse and hunger, despite the gray dusting that dulled the shine that had once been proud, the build was unmistakable. A powerful hindquarter, a distinctive white star set between the eyes, a confirmation that had carried him through countless victories. It was Titan. Marcus felt his stomach drop and his heart race as if a hand had gripped it. The possibility of this sight should have been zero. Titan had been sold 5 years earlier to what everyone believed was an ideal home in California. Pasture retirement, plenty of hay, soft footing, and caretakers who promised gentle hands and patience for a champion that had been trained, loved, and trusted. A champion was not supposed to end up in a killpen, yet here Titan stood, reduced to the price of meat, an animal whose fame had been swallowed by a chain of neglect and poor decisions. Hands shaking, Marcus fumbled for his phone and called the auction office. A voice, detached and bored, answered and identified the lot. The horse had come in the day before from a broker in Nevada listed as Desert Valley Livestock. No papers, no history provided. The facility told Marcus the stallion was about 8 years old and roughly 1,200 pounds, and that the current interest was at kill buyer rates, around 4 cents a pound, which meant Titan's value at the scale was likely to be roughly $500 and change. Marcus asked what it would take to pull the horse before he went into the ring. The answer was simple and terrible. About $1,000 would be enough to make the seller take the offer rather than let the kill buyers have him. Marcus did the math he did not want to do. His accounts were a mess, barely $800 in checking, $300 in savings, cards at their limits. He had been saving $200 for car repairs. But the emergency fund that had been built with tiny, grudging sacrifices existed, and Marcus heard himself say he would buy the horse back. He would pay more than he could spare to take the champion out of the line that fed the slaughter trade. An hour later, he signed a check that might bounce and took the paperwork transferring ownership of Lot 47 back to him. He had spent money intended for a repair on a horse he had once sold. He returned to the pen with the new ownership papers clutched in a hand that trembled. He called the horse's name softly across the chain link, Titan. Of the 47 animals, only the bay stallion raised his head. Titan's ears pricked, whole body tensing as if some old muscle memory had snapped awake, and then his eyes found Marcus's. The recognition that flashed there was not bright relief. It was a look Marcus would carry for years, a flash of memory turned to accusation. Titan stepped between other horses until the two of them stood face to face with only metal and air between them. Up close, Marcus saw the story of what the horse had endured. Pressure sores from being stalled in too tight spaces, ragged wounds, ribs that showed the years of inadequate feeding. The animal's spirit had been knotted into something wary and shut down. Marcus mouthed an apology and the sound left him raw, but Titan's answer was not a welcome. The stallion made a sound that was part refusal, part sorrow, then turned and melted back into the crowd as if to say this human had already chosen him once and abandoned him. It took hours to find a trailer and a driver who would help at short notice, and another small sum that Marcus did not have changed hands to bring Titan home. Loading the horse into the trailer was brutal. He flinched at sudden movements and balked at the ramp, haunted by the history of rough treatment. The trip back to the small property Marcus had managed to hold on to after the collapse of his former life was quiet save for Titan shifting in the trailer. That property was not grand, 5 acres of scrub with a modest barn and a house that was more shelter than home, a place purchased in fits and starts while trying to recover from a failed marriage and financial ruin. Marcus had been boarding other people's horses, giving lessons, scraping by, and now the rescued champion stood in the only stall available, a living accusation beneath a tacky light. Over the next days, the extent of Titan's condition became painfully clear. A veterinarian's visit produced a bill that was as staggering as the sight of the horse himself. Emergency care, antibiotics for infected wounds, x-rays to check for deeper damage, and a guarded prognosis that the stallion could recover physically with consistent, proper care. Titan was malnourished and traumatized, but still young enough that healing was possible. When a vet asked what had happened, the prosecution of truth came out. Titan had been trained by Marcus and sold at the liquidation of the Riverside facility 5 years prior. Faced with an impossible financial choice, Marcus had taken what money he could and watched the horse leave. The vet's response was blunt and cutting, pointing out that the sale had been the moment responsibility had been surrendered and that a trainer's promise of care cannot simply be erased by handing over a check. Guilt landed like blows because the vet's words were accurate. The horse had trusted and been betrayed. Over the coming weeks, Marcus traced the trajectory of Titan's fall. The Hartfields, the wealthy California family who had purchased the stallion, kept Titan for just 18 months. They attempted to use him as a show mount for a teenage daughter in a style that did not match the horse's training, grew dissatisfied when the performances were inconsistent, and sold him on. The next owner ran a tourist-style guest ranch in Nevada where horses were often worked past their limits. From there, the trail blurred as Titan passed through several hands, each transaction descending in both price and care until he was cruelly consigned to an animal broker who sold horses by weight. In 5 years, a decorated show horse worth $45,000 had become a $500 lot in a mud pen. Each owner in that chain had, in different ways, contributed to the downward spiral by selling and reselling with little oversight, sometimes in cash and always with a shrug over responsibility. Marcus's guilt was a physical thing that hollowed nights and stole appetite. Titan accepted food and treatment, but offered no old affection. The trust that had once been given freely was gone. The horse reacted to Marcus not with the warmth of the past, but with a wary politeness that survivors often show, cooperation without intimacy. Earning back any shred of trust required patience measured in months and a willingness to be present even when the presence carried disdain from others. Painful choices had consequences outside the barn. Marcus compiled the record of Titan's collapse, photographs of wounds, veterinary reports, a chain of sales with dates and names, and an open admission that the first, vital link in Titan's fall had been the sale brokered under desperate circumstances. He submitted this account to a major equine publication. When the piece ran as a cover story, the reaction was immediate and fierce. Messages poured in, many laced with anger and accusations, and some escalated into threats. Photographers and social media users showed up at Marcus's property to document Titan's state and to admonish the man who had been the origin point of the horse's trajectory. Local news crews questioned whether material shown in the article painted an accurate picture and whether Marcus should be allowed to continue owning horses. Those voices were harsh, and Marcus endured the public backlash as a logical extension of the private shame he had lived with since the moment the sale had been made. The article had another effect as well. Other trainers reached out privately with confessions, horses sold and forgotten, sales made without follow-up, hands washed clean as animals moved on to unknowable fates. The story revealed an industry truth nobody loved to admit. Once ownership changed hands, many considered responsibility ended there. Months after publication, a law firm representing the Hartfield family filed a defamation suit, arguing the article implied they had been negligent. The suit forced a retraction or clarification that softened wording around direct abuse by the Hartfields, but the reputations of several people and operations were already bruised. Investigations precipitated by the piece led to a shutdown of the tourist ranch run by one of the buyers and to animal cruelty prosecutions for owners found to be keeping horses in abusive conditions. The fallout was complex and ongoing, mixing justice, retribution, and a broader industry reckoning about how living creatures are bought and sold like commodities. For Marcus, the loudest part of the aftermath remained Titan himself. Months of careful attention produced gradual physical improvements. Weight returned, the coat began to regain a healthy shine, and most of the worst wounds healed. Emotionally, the horse remained scarred. He startled at sudden movements, balked at trailers, and sometimes showed defensive aggression toward strangers. Marcus did not insist on immediate transformation. Instead, he rebuilt a life of small, consistent acts meant to restore the most basic sense of safety. Regular feeding times, quiet grooming, the slow reintroduction of touch. Progress came in tiny, painful increments. One evening, while mucking a stall and tired to the marrow, Marcus felt breath and a nudge against the back like a small, deliberate gesture. Titan, who had for months tolerated human proximity without offering warmth, had drawn near and rested his head on a shoulder, the old sign of trust that had been the daily currency of their relationship years before. The moment was fragile and uncertain, like a bridge under slow repair, but it was real. Physical affection returned in increments after that night. Trust was partial and earned, not immediate and unconditional, and Marcus accepted that the animal's process would take as long as it took. Determined that such a collapse should never happen again to another horse, Marcus devised a systematic response that grew into a movement. The Titan Protocol was a certification program urging trainers to maintain contact with horses they had sold for a minimum period and to document the fate of animals with penalties for losing track or selling to buyers who practiced unsafe or unethical treatment. Skepticism and mockery greeted the idea in some corners as impractical or expensive, yet many young trainers and those already uneasy with the transactional nature of the market embraced it. Within 2 years, hundreds of trainers had adopted the protocol on a voluntary basis, and the network helped recover and protect dozens of horses that might otherwise have disappeared into the slaughter pipeline. In other, slower ways, the Titan story altered legal and cultural landscapes. The article and the ensuing documentary raised public awareness and drove legislative conversation about tracking horse sales and strengthening protections against fraudulent or careless resale practices. Laws were proposed and passed in several states requiring more rigorous documentation and traceability of equine transfers. The industry's approach to sales, once framed as routine, began to feel heavier under new scrutiny. The story also invited cultural reckonings about convenience and responsibility. Regret remained a constant companion for Marcus. The narrative never became tidy. A defamation suit had forced a clarification that the Hartfields had not directly abused Titan while they owned him, but they had indeed sold him on to a chain that culminated in the kill pen. The moral fault line was complex and old. Once a living being is treated as an object to be traded for convenience, accountability becomes diffused. Even when legal outcomes favored compromise over condemnation, the ethical argument landed heavily on those who had turned away. Marcus accepted public scorn and private penance as part of living with what had happened, and he used the pain as fuel to push for structural changes. The story attracted attention from a documentary filmmaker who wanted to tell Titan's journey honestly. The terms were explicit. The focus would remain on Titan as the survivor, not on anyone seeking to be cast as the hero. The resulting film, titled The Horse I Betrayed, did not spare the viewer from the cruelty Titan endured or from the human failings that contributed to it. It included interviews with people from all sides, trainers, owners, rescue workers, and it did not flinch from showing the consequences of treating animals as disposable commodities. The final imagery was quiet and powerful. A champion grazing in a pasture while the person who had once sold him sat nearby, present but no longer demanding affection, acknowledging with humility the wrong and working to make amends. The film won awards and pushed the conversation deeper into the public sphere, reaching beyond the horse world to questions about stewardship and the moral costs of convenience. Years after the rescue, life had settled into a new, fragile normal. Titan recovered physically and lived out his days on land kept for his safety, though emotional scars remained visible in spooks and reluctance at unfamiliar people and situations. A legal trust had been established to fund the horse's care indefinitely, purchased by selling nearly everything that had been left. That practical act of devotion ensured Titan would not be sold again, no matter the financial pressure. There was no neat redemption narrative where past wrongs were fully erased. The account remained rooted in consequences and repair rather than absolution. Still, moments of grace occurred. Titan would sometimes seek out quiet contact, rest his head on a shoulder, or move with the easy rhythm of a horse who knew routine and safety. Whether those moments were forgiveness or simply acceptance, they mattered. The wider movement catalyzed by the incident led to greater accountability in many corners of the equine world. Trainers became more vigilant about who bought their horses, rescues strengthened intake and tracking systems, and more people began to treat sale contracts as living documents that included follow-up provisions and checks on future ownership. The slaughter pipeline that had once swallowed champions and backyard mounts alike came under closer scrutiny, and in several communities enforcement efforts increased. Those changes did not erase what had been done to Titan, but they reduced the likelihood that identical chains of neglect would repeat unchecked. The cost, however, lingered. An animal had suffered, and the human who had set events in motion carried the memory like a wound that refused to heal. In a quiet scene decades in the making, a spring morning arrived with a soft sky and a cool breeze over the pasture where Titan ran, moving with a strength that made it easy to forget how close the horse had come to being lost. Now in his early teens and living under a promise that could not be broken, Titan completed a circuit and trotted back to the fence where the familiar human stood watching. The animal snorted and lowered his head, and after a long, careful moment leaned into a touch, a small, deliberate contact that had once been taken for granted. The story asks hard questions rather than offering tidy answers. What is owed to animals entrusted to human care? How deep is the responsibility that comes with transferring ownership? What moral price is paid when convenience or financial need becomes the reason to sell a living being into a chain that can end in slaughter? The chain of events that led Titan from champion to killpen to sanctuary illustrates how easy it is to rationalize a surrender of duty, and how difficult the work of repair can be once harm has been done. If this narrative moves the listener, pass it on to someone who needs to hear that choices have consequences and that compassion requires follow-through, not just promises. Leave a comment with the city and country where this was watched. Share thoughts on how accountability can be built into the equine world. And when ready, support survival stories by subscribing, liking, and sharing this video in a way that turns pain into action and builds a better future for horses everywhere.